Thank you. That was fascinating. Thank you. I really value the insight. The theoretical approach is quite interesting. My name is Matthew Garrett. I'm excited to come out and visit with you all today. Thank you for having me. I've themed my remarks around a book. In the early 20th century, British journalist activist Ella Winter leaned over to an American author by the name of Thomas Wolfe and rhetorically asked, "Don't you know you can't go home again?" Wolfe used that line to title his famous and posthumously published novel. The narrative narrates the fictitious life of a small-town author who ventures into the glimmering lights of the Big Apple. He wins the praise of strangers. He travels the world from New York to London to Berlin, and he is transformed by the experience. He emerges as a new man, hopeful, but also aware that he can never fully, quote, go back home to your family, back home to your childhood, back home to the old forms and systems of things which once seemed everlasting, but which are changing all the time. This adage, "you can never go home again," captures the complexity of the issue I'd like to address today. That is, the comforting familiarity of the past is gone for two reasons. Part of the discord is that individuals change, but it's important to note that the context also changes. The past is not a static place. It is a network of associations and a culture that evolves on its own accord. I find this understanding of dualistic adaptation over time useful in looking at Navajo youth who in the 1950s and 1960s joined the LDS Church and participated in the Lamanite programs. These people underwent undeniable personal changes. And at the same time, the Navajo Nation transformed. And outside its borders, a larger Indian activist movement erupted and also altered the way many Native people viewed themselves and their communities. As context evolved, Navajo Mormons adapted, and in the end, many felt they could never quite return home again. Still others, defiantly challenging the adage, claimed to fit in when they returned. Today, I'd like to suspend the well-tread narrative of white colonization of Indians and instead look to the issue of changing Indians and changing Indian context during the mid to late 20th century. I don't want to dismiss colonization, which is, of course, central to the issue and worthy of a long speech on its own. Even decolonization studies, which has become quite useful in the last several decades, has been effective in drawing focus on long overlooked Native voices and long overlooked Native concerns. So it plays an important role. But it's also imposed a bit of a false dichotomy by creating oppressors and resistors, which obviate Native voices that don't neatly fit within that binary model. What are we to do with those Native American youths who embrace the Lamanite identity, complete with theology and culture? Are they any less Indian? And how does their authenticity compare to that of the Red Power activist raised in the suburbs, or the young adult Navajo raised in the internet era? Decades ago, James Clifford, historian, criticized dichotomies that, quote, do not account for complex historical processes of appropriation, compromise, subversion, masking, invention, and revival. So there we are, aware of the obvious role of colonizer and resistor, but searching for some greater complexity in between. And that's why I think Native people who engaged in the LDS programs are so fascinating. They reflect a broad spectrum of experiences and attitudes. They left a changing reservation, engaged in a radical redefinition of self, and then in the aftermath of that transformation expressed mixed responses regarding not only the LDS Church, but also the reservation they once called home. The first step in understanding the attitudes and experiences is to look at the changing context. Focus today primarily on Navajos, or Dene as they call themselves, for both the purpose and clarity, and because they were by far the most dominant participants in the LDS programs. Navajos have always been an adaptive people. Archaeologists speculate that they moved to the Four Corners region around 1300 AD. They competed with and coexisted with the drought-stricken ancestral Puebloan people, who are better known as Anasazi, which literally translates as enemy in the Navajo language. Despite this conflict, Navajos drew most of their modern clan names from those people. Several centuries later, the Spanish introduced sheep to the region, and pastoralism soon became a central part of Dene experience and identity, and the quantity of sheep in a herd a direct reflection of status. Navajos spread out on the range, and decentralized culture predominated. That is until Kit Carson raided into their lands and forced thousands on the long walk to arid and acidic lands in New Mexico. The brutal experience consolidated disparate communities and allowed for individual headmen to emerge as tribal leaders. In many ways, the horrors of the starvation and exposure at Bosque Redondo also gave birth to the modern Navajo nation. Incarceration also introduced fry bread and the calico and sateen skirts paired with velveteen blouses that are today hallmarks of traditional Navajo clothing. When Dene returned to the Four Corners region, they brought with them a firm and justified distrust of white men, and they fled into canyons to hide from Indian agents who were intent on enrolling their children in boarding schools, until World War II jolted the tribe from isolationism. Wartime jobs in Phoenix, Santa Fe, Salt Lake City proved temporary, but they spawned the demand for the white man's education and a modernization that over the next few decades drastically transformed the Navajo Nation. And it's in that context that Mormons reached out to Navajos who desperately sought education. Mormons had their own agendas, to be sure, to help the Lamanites blossom as the rose. Those motivations are important aspects, but they should not diminish the agency of those Navajos who did enroll in such programs. Each year, Mormon missionaries assigned to the Southwest Indian Mission recruited children for Indian Seminary and Indian Student Placement Program. The latter eventually enrolled some 50,000 Indian children, mostly Navajos, and placed them in LDS foster homes during the school months. Some withdrew. Others enrolled year after year. The church organized monthly Indian activities and leadership training that culminated in the annual Lamanite Conference, which recognized those who demonstrated strong academic and spiritual success, the latter defined in LDS terms, of course. And when these Navajo Mormons returned to their reservations in the summers and after graduation, what did other Navajos think of them? Before I give you some data that might answer that question, I think it's important to note how the Navajo Nation was changing at the same time. The reservation underwent a socioeconomic revolution. Seasonally inaccessible dirt roads and a barter economy gave way during the 1950s to 300 miles of bridges and highways and another 350 miles of granite roads, crushed granite roads. Extractive industries from petroleum and coal and uranium produced a cash economy. The roads and wages introduced outside products and values during the 1960s and 1970s. In the mid-1970s, one Dene elder recalled with some awe that, quote, "We have grocery stores filled with food, clothing markets full of clothes, and other shops equipped with whatever we wish to purchase." The Navajo Times increasingly advertised household appliances, credit cards, automobiles, all reflecting an unprecedented expansion of Navajo wages and purchasing power. Beginning in the late 1970s, shopping malls arose in Window Rock, Tuba City, Chinle, Kayenta, and by the close of the decade, the annual tribal fair divided the prestigious princess title into two categories, Miss Traditional Navajo and Miss Modern Navajo. Many community elders expressed horror over what they perceived as cultural loss. In the preface to his 1977 collection of autobiographical sketches, one historian observed that, quote, "Elders feel that undesirable traits may have been acquired through contact with the dominant society and through television, modern literature, and a generally low quality of cinema," end quote. In interview after interview, tribal elders cited declining family values and the deterioration of extended clan relationships. Essentially, they resented the reckless individualism and characterized that critique as cultural loss. They saw Western values as unwanted intruders that produced defiant children, sexual promiscuity, religious defection, and language loss. Dirt floor hogans could no longer suffice the new generation. They wanted, quote, soft beds, clean clothes, plenty of water, and electricity. As the Navajo Nation transformed, broader changes also swept Native people nationwide. War industry jobs, followed by 1950s federal termination and urbanization efforts, relocated many Natives to city centers. And by 1970, about half of Native Americans lived off of reservations. There, they built in cities intertribal connections that spawned a new movement, Red Power. These urban Indians joined in a variety of organizations that adopted more confrontational media-centered tactics. They succeeded in winning national attention, vital legislation, but older reservation Indians often viewed them with some suspicion. It is in these changing contexts that the LDS Indian Program graduates began to come of age. Youth and teens who participated in the placement program certainly learned new ideas far beyond what their parents anticipated them when volunteering their children for education. How did those children fare upon their return to the reservation? Each summer or after graduation? The church had the same question, and it hired an outside contractor to conduct a large survey that ultimately received 783 respondents, including a few child participants and tribal leaders, but primarily focused on parents, most of whom were not LDS. The report was never intended for outside use, which I think adds some to its credibility, though we might speculate a greater likelihood of response from those with more positive views. Nevertheless, it found that 95% of parents had a good or very good attitude about placement, as did 92% of current students and 81% of former students. 78% of parents and 63% of tribal leaders said that placement made their children stronger tribal members. The report also demonstrated that tribal leaders, parents, and students believed that participants fit well and that it was not harmful to their identity. Listeners today might be suspicious of those results. In the growing age of activism, many outsiders also grew skeptical of the placement program. In 1976, the Interstate Commerce Administration, which oversaw child placements across state lines, directed its South Dakota director to survey placement program participants. He, too, expected to find more critical attitudes, but instead found, quote, no sense from any of the respondents that they were not satisfied with the program as it was being administered presently by the LDS Church. A shocking 70% said that they felt LDS foster families helped their Indian children better understand their identity with their Native heritage. This can't be right? It is tempting to assume the data must be flawed, that it must somehow be selective. Perhaps it is. But there's also a problem here that stems from this desire to reject the data because of a false notion of oppressors and resistors, when in fact there's a much more complex phenomenon happening in between. The most famous self-identified Lamanite, George P. Lee, wrote, quote, words cannot describe the sweetness, the warmth, the tremendous impressions that the Spirit made upon me when I realized that God loved my people, the Indian people, that God loved me as an Indian. He frequently gushed about the blessings of the gospel and his Indian heritage, or his Lamanite heritage. For Lee and others, the Mormon theology somehow proved empowering. I could inundate you with similar quotes from other former participants. I don't mean to imply that this feeling was universal, because I have just as many quotes from former participants expressing frustration, resentment, sadness, or hostility towards the church for cultural genocide. Many former participants carry around elements of all of those feelings. The key to understanding this is to accept the full spectrum of possible responses and then to begin picking apart the gradations in between to see how different people defined their Indianness in the changing context. Many former placement program children went on to BYU, and there they sparred with each other and outsiders about the very meaning of a Lamanite. Self-proclaimed Lamanites tended to discount communal efforts in favor of individualism. They usually advocated conservative reform by working within the system and faulted Red Power activists for their non-traditional and sensationalist methods. When the American Indian movement leaders visited BYU in the 1970s, they were run off by Native women at the Y. Miss Nora Mae Begay, former placement program participant, and Miss Indian BYU and Miss Indian America, explained, quote, "The militant movements are disgracing to the Indian heritage." This cleavage between self-identified Lamanites and Red Power activists is interesting. Both groups vied for authenticity of their own new pan-Indian movement. When Clyde Warrior served as president of the National Indian Youth Council, he famously authored an essay assessing 5 types of fake Indians. He identified slobs, jokers, these are his words, ultra-pseudo-Indians, angry nationalists, and sellouts. Another activist, Lehman Brightman, frequently denounced non-activist Indians, even his elders, as Uncle Tomahawks. In this changing context of competing identities, one former placement student asked, "What is being Indian?" He went on to explain that, quote, "There are no rules." This particular student rejected the American Indian movement model of Indianness and said, quote, who are they to say that they are the teachers of the Indian people?" But Indians at BYU were far from united themselves, at least during the 1960s, when repeated clashes over Indian dances divided the student population. Paul Felt, director of Indian programs at BYU, in 1966 struck down the dances from the annual Indian Week festivities. Students appealed to President Wilkinson, and he restored the dances. But over the following years, BYU Indian student leaders increasingly took aim at the activity. In one meeting, then graduate student John Rayner of Pueblo expressed concern that, quote, "The Lamanite student is being shackled by the old identity. We are not that anymore," end quote. Now, less correlated Lamanites continued to practice their dances and debated true Indianness at BYU. Victor Salem attended the Y in the early 1970s and tested the dress code with his long hair. He grew angry when organizers rejected his Red Power panel proposal for Indian Week. And after expulsion, he declared that BYU was full of, quote, "apples," red-skinned Indians with white on the inside. And then there's Stanley Snake, who both attended BYU and served as president of the National Indian Youth Council that gave birth to the Red Power movement. He commented that, quote, "I've had to answer questions about the Mormon church. And at the same time, I've had to answer the Mormons about why I'm a member of NIYC, which some consider to be militant," end quote. He said that he thought of himself as, quote, "a buffer between the Mormon church and certain segments of the Red Power movement." So what are we to do with this? Some Indians rejected the Lamanite identity, pitched by missionaries and foster parents. Others embraced it as a source of strength, even those competed among themselves year after year about just what a Lamanite meant and what was an Indian. Some held it up as an alternative to the Red Power model that equally broke with tradition and established a geographically boundless pan-Indian identity. Neither fit within the old traditions of the 1950s, but those traditions had given way to more modern ideas anyhow. None of them, not the Lamanites, not the Red Power activists, or even the modern Navajos, could ever really return to decades earlier because that home space too had changed. So it's complicated. What do we make of all of them? I really don't know, and I dare not speak too far on their behalf. But I will return to the words of Thomas Wolfe, whose book I introduced at the introduction, and his fictional tale of the gentleman that's traveling the world and his difficulties. At the close of that novel, the main character finally realizes the complexity of his situation. He says, quote, "He knew now, as he had never known before, the priceless measure of his loss. He also knew the priceless measure of his gain. He was out, and being out, there was no road back." And so it is with the Lamanites created in the mid to late 20th century. Many still are among us today. Some take great pride in their Lamanite status, others despise it as an emblem of assimilation, but most bear a mixed attitude, complicated by overlapping feelings of loss and gain, and that's why their story is so worth telling. Thank you.
So we have some time for some questions, if anybody has one. We would ask that you use a microphone. Let's see, our mic person is somewhere. Christian. Question, yes. It looks like it's not going to go. Do you want to come up here for now and ask your question? I'm sorry. We usually have a wireless mic up here, but.
I just wanted to ask you, how do you see similarities or connections, if you do, from what was happening with the Red Power movement to perhaps the activism going on now in the groups with Standing Rock and Keystone Pipeline and whatnot? And that might be, an on-the-nose question,